You've been giving away your power your whole life and you didn't even notice it. Every time you reacted when silence would have protected you, every time you explained yourself to people who were never really listening, every time you let someone pull you into something that didn't deserve your energy, you gave away a piece of your focus, your peace, and your control. It doesn't feel like a loss at the moment. It feels like you're doing the right thing, like you're standing up for yourself, like you're being responsible. But if you look closely, you'll start to see a pattern forming underneath it all, a pattern where your state is constantly being shaped by things outside of you. And here's the part most people never question. What if reacting is not strength? What if explaining is not clarity? What if constantly engaging is the very thing keeping you stuck in the same cycles? Because long before modern self-help tried to fix behavior on the surface, Stoic thinkers were focused on something deeper, something more precise. Marcus Aurelius didn't try to control the world around him. He trained himself to control how he responded to it. And that changes everything. Because when your mind becomes steady, the chaos outside loses its influence. When your reactions are no longer automatic, your presence becomes intentional. And when you stop giving your energy to everything, your energy starts to carry weight. If these conversations speak to something real in you, something grounded in truth, philosophy, and inner growth, consider subscribing. It's a small gesture, but it helps us reach more minds like yours. And it quietly signals that you're walking this path with intention. You've been giving away your power your whole life, and the hardest part to accept is that most of the time it didn't happen in big dramatic moments. It happened quietly, in small reactions, in quick explanations, in situations that felt insignificant but slowly shaped the way you experience everything. It happened when someone said something that didn't sit right with you, and you felt the need to respond, to correct, to defend. It happened when you tried to explain yourself to people who had already decided how they saw you. It happened when you allowed something small to take up space in your mind long after it should have passed. And over time, those small moments turned into a pattern, a way of living where your state depends more on what happens around you than on what you choose within yourself. At first, this doesn't feel like a problem. It feels normal. It feels like you're just reacting the way anyone would. But when you step back and observe it carefully, you start to see that most of your energy is not being used to build anything meaningful. It is being spent managing situations that don't truly matter. You are responding, explaining, adjusting, and engaging in ways that keep you busy but don't move you forward. And that is where the shift begins, not in changing everything at once, but in recognizing that something deeper is happening beneath your reactions. The Stoics understood this in a way that still feels relevant because it cuts through the noise and goes straight to the structure of how we think. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself as a way to stay aligned with reality, not to impress anyone, not to perform, but to remind himself that his peace depended on his ability to remain steady regardless of what happened around him. He knew that if he allowed every external event to shape his internal state, he would lose control over the one thing that truly mattered, which was his own mind. When you begin to apply that idea to your own life, something starts to become clear. Most of the things that disturb you are not as powerful as they seem. They gain power through your attention, through your reaction, through the meaning you assign to them. Without that, they lose their weight. But the challenge is that your mind has been trained to react automatically, to interpret quickly, to attach meaning before you even have time to question it. This is where awareness becomes important, not as a concept, but as a practice. You begin to notice the moment something triggers you, the slight shift in your thoughts, the emotional pull, the urge to respond. It happens quickly, almost instantly. But once you start paying attention, you realize that there is a small space between what happens and how you react. That space may be brief, but it is real. And within that space, there is a choice. Epictetus expressed this clearly when he said that it is not events that disturb you, but your judgment about them. That means the disturbance is not coming from the outside, it is being created within. And if it is being created, it can also be changed. But that change does not come from forcing yourself to feel differently. It comes from seeing the situation more clearly, from removing the layers of interpretation that your mind automatically adds. Carl Jung spoke about something similar when he said that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Most people move through life without realizing how much of their behavior is driven by patterns they never questioned. They think they are choosing, but in reality, they are repeating. They are responding in ways that feel natural because they have done it so many times before. And once you see that, the goal is no longer to react better, but to react less. Not in a passive or disconnected way, but in a way that is more intentional. You begin to understand that not every situation deserves your response. Not every comment requires your attention. Not every misunderstanding needs to be corrected. And when you stop treating everything as important, you begin to see what actually is. This is where the idea of silence starts to take on a different meaning. Silence is not weakness, it is not avoidance, it is the ability to remain unmoved when something does not deserve movement. It is the decision to conserve your energy instead of scattering it across things that do not contribute to your direction. It is the recognition that your words have value, and that value decreases when they are used without intention. There is a kind of strength in saying less, not because you have nothing to say, but because you understand when it is unnecessary, and over time this changes the way others perceive you, not because you are trying to create an image, but because your presence becomes more grounded. You are no longer reacting in predictable ways. You are no longer explaining yourself constantly. You are no longer engaging in every situation that tries to pull you in, and that creates a shift, not just externally, but internally. You feel less drained, you feel more focused, you feel more in control of your own state, because you are no longer giving your attention away freely, you are choosing where it goes. This becomes even more important when you consider how much of your life is influenced by the need to be understood. It feels important to explain yourself, to make sure others see your intentions clearly, to correct misunderstandings before they spread. But in reality, this often leads to more confusion, not less, because people interpret things through their own perspective, their own beliefs, their own experiences. Trying to control that interpretation is a losing effort, and the more you try, the more energy you lose in the process. At some point, you begin to understand that not everyone needs to understand you, and that your actions over time will communicate far more than your explanations ever could. This is where ignoring becomes a form of discipline rather than avoidance. You are not ignoring because you are afraid to engage, but because you recognize that engagement is not always valuable. You are choosing not to invest in something that does not serve your direction. You are choosing to protect your focus. And this protection is not about building walls, but about creating clarity. You become more aware of what deserves your time, your attention, and your energy. You become more selective, not out of arrogance, but out of understanding. And that selectivity changes everything. Because when your attention is not constantly being pulled in different directions, you begin to move with more purpose. You begin to act with more intention. You begin to see your own patterns more clearly and adjust them in a way that aligns with where you want to go. Over time, this creates a different kind of confidence, one that does not depend on external validation or constant feedback. It comes from knowing that you can maintain your state regardless of what happens around you. It comes from trusting your ability to respond thoughtfully rather than react automatically. And that trust becomes the foundation for something deeper, a sense of stability that is not easily shaken, a clarity that is not easily clouded, a presence that is not easily disturbed. This is not something that happens overnight. It is built gradually, through repeated choices, through moments where you pause instead of react, where you observe instead of engage, where you choose silence instead of explanation. And each of those moments adds to a structure that becomes stronger over time. Eventually, you begin to notice that situations that once affected you deeply no longer have the same impact. The need to respond fades. The urge to explain weakens. The habit of reacting loses its grip. And in its place, something more stable begins to form. You become less concerned with what others think and more focused on how you act. You become less reactive to situations and more intentional in your responses. You become less available to distractions and more aligned with your direction. And that is where the real shift happens, not in changing who you are on the surface, but in changing how you operate at the core. Because when you stop reacting, you take back control. When you stop explaining, you preserve your energy. When you start ignoring what does not matter, you create space for what does. And in that space, your life begins to change, not because everything around you is different, but because you are no longer the same person responding to it. And as this steadiness becomes more familiar, something else begins to change, something that is often overlooked but deeply important, and that is the way you relate to your own thoughts. Before, your thoughts may have felt like commands, like something you had to follow, something that defined how you felt and how you acted. A thought would appear, and almost instantly it would shape your mood, your reaction, your direction. There was very little separation between thinking and doing. But now, with awareness becoming more consistent, you begin to notice that a thought is not a command, it is simply a suggestion. It appears, it passes, and in between those 2 points, there is a space where you can decide whether it deserves your attention or not. This realization changes everything because it means you are no longer controlled by every idea that enters your mind. You begin to filter your thoughts in the same way you have learned to filter your reactions. This filtering process is not about rejecting everything that feels uncomfortable, but about understanding what is useful and what is not. Some thoughts are worth exploring, worth developing, worth acting on. Others are simply noise, repetitions of old patterns that no longer serve you. And once you can distinguish between the two, your mental environment becomes clearer, quieter, and far more focused. In that clarity, your ability to concentrate deepens because you are no longer pulled in multiple directions by every passing thought or external distraction. You begin to give your full attention to what you are doing, whether it is a task, a conversation, or a decision. And that level of focus creates a kind of effectiveness that is difficult to achieve when your mind is scattered. At the same time, your emotional landscape becomes more stable, not because you no longer feel anything, but because your feelings are no longer amplified by unchecked thoughts. You feel what is real, but you do not build unnecessary layers on top of it. You allow emotions to move through you without letting them define your entire state. And that balance creates a sense of calm that is not fragile, but grounded. This grounded state begins to influence how you handle pressure as well. Situations that once felt overwhelming now feel manageable, not because they are smaller, but because you are no longer reacting to them with the same intensity. You approach them with clarity, with patience, with the understanding that not every problem requires an immediate or emotional response. Marcus Aurelius often reminded himself that if something is not right, he does not have to do it, and if something is not true, he does not have to say it. This simple guideline becomes incredibly powerful when applied consistently because it reduces unnecessary action and unnecessary speech, allowing you to move through situations with precision rather than excess. As this precision develops, you begin to notice that your actions become more aligned with your values, not because you are forcing yourself to act a certain way, but because you have removed the impulses that once distracted you. You are no longer pulled toward what feels urgent but meaningless. You are drawn toward what is meaningful, even if it requires more effort or patience. This shift also changes how you experience success and failure, because you are no longer defining them purely by outcomes. Instead, you begin to measure them by alignment, by whether your actions reflect your understanding and your principles. This creates a kind of consistency that remains steady even when results fluctuate, because your sense of direction is not dependent on immediate feedback. Over time, this way of living begins to reshape your identity at a deeper level. You are no longer someone who reacts to everything, who explains constantly, who engages without intention. You become someone who observes, who chooses, who acts with clarity. And this identity is not something you declare. It is something that becomes visible through your behavior, through your consistency, through the way you handle situations that once controlled you. People may notice this change, even if they cannot fully explain it. They may see that you are less reactive, less available to unnecessary conflict, more focused, more grounded. And while some may respect it, others may not understand it because it does not fit into the patterns they are used to. But that is part of the process. Growth often creates distance between you and the expectations that once defined your behavior. And in that distance, you gain something valuable, the freedom to move in a way that is aligned with your understanding rather than shaped by external pressure. You are no longer trying to meet every expectation or respond to every demand. You are choosing your path with intention, guided by clarity rather than impulse. As this continues, you begin to see that the idea of ignoring is not about disengaging from life, but about engaging with it more intelligently. You are not withdrawing, you are refining. You are not avoiding, you are prioritizing. You are not becoming passive, you are becoming precise. This precision allows you to invest your energy where it matters most, in your growth, in your direction, in the things that contribute to your long-term development. And because your energy is no longer scattered, your progress becomes more consistent, more stable, and more meaningful. Carl Jung spoke about the importance of becoming who you truly are, not who you have been conditioned to be, and this process reflects that idea in a practical way. As you remove the patterns that were never consciously chosen, you create space for something more authentic to emerge, something that is not driven by habit, but by understanding. And as that authenticity becomes more visible in your actions, you begin to experience a sense of alignment that is difficult to achieve when your behavior is driven by reaction. You are no longer divided between what you know and what you do. You are no longer pulled in conflicting directions by competing impulses. You move with a sense of coherence that simplifies your experience of life. At this point, the central principle becomes deeply integrated into how you operate. You do not react because you understand the cost of uncontrolled responses. You do not explain unnecessarily because you recognize the limits of words in shaping perception. You ignore what does not matter because you value your attention too much to waste it. And in living this way, you begin to see that your life is no longer defined by the same patterns that once kept you in place. It is shaped by your choices, your awareness, and your ability to remain steady even when the world around you is not. This is not a final destination, but an ongoing process, one that requires continued attention, continued reflection, and continued commitment to acting with intention. But as you continue, the effort begins to feel lighter, the clarity becomes more natural, and the stability becomes more consistent. And that is where the transformation becomes undeniable, not because everything around you has changed, but because you have changed in the way you engage with it, in the way you think, in the way you respond, and in the way you choose what deserves your attention. And that, more than anything else, is what separates a life that is reactive and scattered from one that is intentional, focused, and quietly powerful. And as you continue to live from that place, something even more subtle begins to unfold, something that is not immediately visible but becomes clear over time through the way you feel, the way you think, and the way you move through situations that once felt overwhelming. You begin to realize that the world has not become quieter, people have not suddenly become more understanding, and situations have not become easier, but your experience of all of it has changed in a way that gives you more space, more control, and more clarity than you had before. This shift does not come from forcing yourself to be calm or trying to suppress your reactions, because suppression always creates tension, and tension eventually finds a way to release itself. Instead, it comes from understanding your reactions so clearly that they no longer control you. You begin to see them as temporary signals rather than absolute truths, as movements within your mind rather than commands you must follow. And in that understanding, the urgency behind those reactions begins to fade. There is a difference between feeling something and becoming it. Before, you might have felt anger and immediately acted from it, as if the feeling itself required expression. Now you feel it, but you do not become it. You observe it, you allow it to pass, and you decide what to do next without letting it define your response. That separation creates a level of control that most people never develop, not because it is impossible, but because it requires a kind of awareness that is rarely practiced. As this awareness deepens, your relationship with time begins to change as well. You are no longer rushing to respond, no longer feeling the need to resolve everything immediately, no longer reacting to every situation as if it demands instant attention. You begin to move with a different pace, one that is not slow in a passive sense, but deliberate in a focused sense. You give yourself the space to think before you act, to understand before you respond, and to choose rather than react. This deliberate way of moving through life begins to influence everything you do. Your decisions become more aligned, your actions become more consistent, and your outcomes begin to reflect that alignment in ways that feel stable rather than unpredictable. You are no longer being pulled in multiple directions by external demands, because you have become selective about what you allow to influence you. And with that selectivity comes a deeper understanding of boundaries, not as something you impose on others, but as something you maintain within yourself. You begin to recognize where your responsibility ends and where others' responsibilities begin. You stop taking ownership of things that do not belong to you, and in doing so, you free yourself from a great deal of unnecessary stress and emotional weight. This does not mean that you become disconnected or indifferent in a negative sense, but that you become more precise in how you engage. You give your energy where it matters. You invest your attention where it has value. And you withdraw from what does not contribute to your growth or your direction. This balance allows you to remain involved in life without being consumed by it. Seneca once emphasized that we suffer more in imagination than in reality, and this idea becomes increasingly clear as you observe your own mind. Much of what disturbs you is not what is happening, but what you believe might happen, what you think it means, or what you fear it could lead to. When you begin to separate reality from imagination, you remove a large part of the pressure that creates unnecessary reactions. This clarity allows you to approach situations with a level of calm that is not forced, but natural. You are no longer trying to control every outcome, because you understand that control is limited to your actions and your responses. You focus on what you can influence, and you release what you cannot. And in doing so, you create a sense of stability that is not easily disrupted. At the same time, you begin to notice that your presence itself starts to carry a different kind of weight. You do not need to speak as much to be heard. You do not need to react as much to be understood. You do not need to explain as much to be respected. There is a quiet confidence that develops when your actions are consistent and your responses are intentional. and that confidence is felt by others even if it is not explicitly expressed. People may not always understand why you are different, but they will notice that you are not easily pulled into situations, that you do not respond in predictable ways, that your reactions are measured rather than immediate. And that difference creates a kind of respect that is not based on what you say, but on how you carry yourself. This is not about controlling how others see you, but about becoming someone who is not defined by external perception. You begin to care less about being understood by everyone and more about being aligned with your own principles. And that alignment becomes your reference point, guiding your decisions in a way that feels steady and consistent. As this continues, the idea of ignoring takes on an even deeper meaning, because it is no longer just about avoiding unnecessary engagement, but about consciously choosing what deserves your focus. You begin to see that your attention is one of your most valuable resources, and that where you direct it shapes your experience more than almost anything else. When you give your attention to something, you give it importance. When you withdraw your attention, you reduce its influence. This is not about denial, but about prioritization. You are deciding what matters and what does not, and that decision shapes the direction of your life. Over time, this creates a shift in how you experience challenges as well. You are no longer overwhelmed by them because you approach them with clarity rather than emotion. You are able to see what needs to be done without adding unnecessary layers of stress or frustration. And this allows you to act more effectively, not because the situation is easier, but because your approach is more grounded. Carl Jung spoke about the process of becoming whole, of integrating different aspects of the self into a more complete and balanced state. In many ways, this journey reflects that idea, because as you become more aware of your patterns and more intentional in your responses, you begin to align your thoughts, your actions, and your values in a way that reduces internal conflict. You are no longer divided between what you know and what you do, between what you feel and how you act. This alignment creates a sense of peace that is not dependent on external conditions. It is not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of clarity. It is not the elimination of challenges, but the ability to move through them without losing your sense of direction. And as this becomes more consistent, you begin to see that the life you are creating is not defined by dramatic changes, but by steady progress, by the accumulation of small decisions that reflect awareness and intention. You are not trying to become someone else, but to refine who you are in a way that is more aligned with your values and your understanding. At this point, the central idea becomes less of a concept and more of a reality. You no longer react automatically because you have learned to pause and observe. You no longer feel the need to explain everything because you understand that your actions speak more clearly than your words. You no longer engage with what drains you because you have become selective with your attention. And in that state, something becomes clear that changes how you see everything moving forward. The power you were searching for was never in controlling others, never in winning arguments, never in proving yourself, but in mastering your own responses, in choosing where your energy goes, and in building a way of thinking that allows you to remain steady regardless of what happens around you. That is the quiet transformation that unfolds when you begin to live this way, not loud, not obvious, but deeply effective, shaping your life from the inside out, one decision at a time, until the version of you that once reacted to everything has been replaced by someone who moves with clarity, purpose, and a kind of strength that does not need to be shown, because it is simply there.